An Adelaide woman and her lover will spend more than 20 years behind bars for the murder of her husband Steven Hinrichsen in 2018. Key points: Tanya Hinrichsen conspired to murder her husband Steven. Tanya Hinrichsen conspired to murder her husband Steven. Her lover Gavin Scott Skinner stabbed the victim more than 50 times. Her lover Gavin Scott Skinner stabbed the victim more than 50 times. A third person, Robert John Thrupp, was found guilty of manslaughter and will spend at least 7 years in jail. Tanya Hinrichsen conspired to murder her husband and has been handed a 22-year non-parole period in the Supreme Court. Justice Sophie David said her lover Gavin Scott Skinner stabbed the man more than 50 times and will spend at least 24 years in prison. A third man, Robert John Thrupp, will remain in jail for at least 7 years after he was found guilty of manslaughter. Mr. Hinrichsen, who used a wheelchair, was found stabbed to death at his Morphett Vale home in December 2018. Steven Hinrichsen was murdered by his wife Tanya and her lover Gavin Scott Skinner at Morphett Vale. Supplied. During sentencing submissions earlier this month, the Supreme Court heard the murder of the 63-year-old grandfather was carried out with an extreme level of violence. Egregious abuse of trust. Justice Sophie David today said Hinrichsen had become increasingly resentful of her husband and viewed him as an impediment to her new relationship with Skinner. She said that, incredibly, Hinrichsen had wanted the victim to agree to letting Skinner stay at their house some nights a week. A text message sent from Skinner to Tanya Hinrichsen said, "I'm so ready to go on a hunting spree." She replied, "If it's to do him, then I'll give you my permission." The judge said Hinrichsen committed an egregious abuse of her husband's trust. ABC News. The court heard Skinner and Thrupp went to the home, and that Skinner attacked Steven Hinrichsen, causing 50 wounds to his head and body. A photograph was smashed over his head, and the knife was dumped behind the stove. Mr. Hinrichsen had been confined to a wheelchair through various ailments. Justice David said she accepted Tanya Hinrichsen was not present at the time of the killing and did not anticipate the level of violence. Steven Hinrichsen was murdered at Morphett Vale in December 2018. ABC News, Isadora Bogle. But she said that she had murdered the father of their children and must now live with the consequences of your conduct. Your offending in conduct, in intentionally encouraging Gavin Skinner to murder the deceased, was an egregious abuse of your husband's trust, she said. You were his wife and you were his carer, you knew that he loved and trusted you. He was a vulnerable man, incapacitated and confined to a wheelchair, yet you encouraged another to murder him for your own selfish purposes. It is difficult to comprehend your motivation to commit this offense. It was open to you to simply leave your husband. Nothing less than frenzied. In sentencing Hinrichsen's co-accused, Justice David said Skinner had inflicted a brutal attack on a vulnerable man for your own selfish purposes. This was nothing less than a frenzied attack, she said. It was completely unjustified and gratuitous. Gavin Scott Skinner inflicted the blows against Mr. Hinrichsen. ABC News. On Thrupp, Justice David said that he was present in the deceased's home when Skinner inflicted the fatal wounds. You knew the deceased was vulnerable and incapacitated, and Gavin Skinner held much animosity towards him and had assaulted him on one previous occasion, Justice David said. While you did not physically inflict any of the wounds or injuries to the deceased, you were in sufficient proximity to see what had taken place. When interviewed by police later that day, you denied having attended at the deceased's home with Gavin Skinner. It is difficult in those circumstances to give any weight to the expressions of remorse made by you to a psychologist or on your behalf by counsel. Outside court, Mr. Hinrichsen's daughters and sister said they welcomed the verdicts and justice had been served.